Recently, my D&D group has decided that we would try to play online, so I, as DM, wanted to come up with a way to still have a visual representation of combat and dungeon crawling, despite not having our game mat and miniatures with us. Because of that, I ended up running our adventure through online video conferencing and using Photoshop to show our battle map, and it worked out better than I was expecting. After doing so, one of my players, who is going to be running his own campaign shortly, asked if I could show him how I set up my document and controlled movement of players and monsters or enemies. I figured it was something that other DMs could use, as more and more games are probably going online right now. While there are other online tools that help with running D&D online, they often felt either overly complicated or they didn't have quite the behaviors that I wanted them to. And so I wanted to show you how you can use Photoshop to run combat and run your game in D&D. So I'm currently using the most updated version of Photoshop, which is version 21.1.1, but everything that I'm going to show you should be doable in every version of Photoshop. Alright, so to start off, I'm going to be using one of the earlier encounters or dungeons in the Wizards of the Coast adventure, Lost Mines of Phandelver, and use this as my example. So as you can see, I already loaded in both my player map and my DM version of the map. You don't need to load in the DM version if you don't want to. I just did it in case I needed to reference which area is which, but for this map specifically, I probably won't need the DM version. To open up your map, simply go to File, Open, and navigate towards the image that you want to use. This video isn't going to go over how to make your own maps, but I may make one in the future for that, but for now, this is just going to be how to use Photoshop to run your game. So now that you have your file open, you're going to see me setting up various layers and folders within Photoshop. I like setting up my folders first to make sure I don't forget anything, but you can do it as you go along if you like. To create folders, simply click on the folder icon down at the bottom right, and to create new layers, click the New Layer button. That is the small little plus sign inside the square that's right next to the folder button. You can name your folders and layers by double-clicking on the text, and you can reorder them simply by dragging and dropping them where you want. So you see I set up two separate folders, one for the monsters and the other one is for my players. This is not only for organization, but for moving them around the map and not disclosing what other creatures may be on the map as the players are. Essentially avoiding spoilers so they don't know what's coming. So within the monster folder, I made new folders for each expected encounter throughout the dungeon. We all know D&D rarely goes as planned, but having this baseline of what you expect the encounters to be like, or at least including all the creatures or enemies in a certain area, gives you the ability to adapt your combat much easier rather than having to create everything after the players have already rolled initiative. Alright, so now that I have my folders set up, let's go ahead and create our player characters on the map. So first off, you're going to click on your player characters folder and click New Layer. If the layer doesn't appear within the folder, you can tell because it'll slightly be offset to the right. You can simply drag and drop the layer on top of the folder and add it there. Now typically you would want to name your layers to stay organized, but this layer isn't going to stay around the entire time, so I'm not going to worry about it as it's just going to be a simple layer. So on our blank layer, we are going to make a token to represent one of our players, and we are going to do this by selecting the marquee tool by either hitting the M key or by going over to our tools panel and finding it there. And you're going to want to make sure that you have the elliptical marquee tool. If that is not selected, simply click and hold on the tool that is showing and select the one we want. Alright, so now, because the grid is already set up on our map as one square being 5 feet, we're going to make our tokens the size of the square. So position your cursor in the center of one of the squares and hold down the Shift and Option if you are on a Mac, or Shift and Alt if you are on a PC, and drag your mouse outward. Holding Shift down constrains your proportions, keeping it a perfect circle, while Option or Alt draws from the center outward. Once you have the size you like, go ahead and let go of your mouse, and you should see the boundary set for what you have drawn. Now go ahead and hit the D key on your keyboard to make sure that you have the default colors of black and white set. Then go ahead and hit the Command and Backspace keys if you're on a Mac, or Alt for a PC. And it should be or it should fill in the circle you made with white. Now we are going to apply a stroke to the circle we just made by double-clicking on the layer that the circle is on. We are just going to click stroke in the menu that pops up. Make sure you don't just click the check mark, but click on the panel so the options to edit the stroke pops up. And within those settings, you're going to want to change the size to probably roughly around a 4 pixel size and position the stroke on the outside of your object. You can go ahead and then pick your color. If you want to identify your players by different colors, you can do that, but I just chose to make all of my PCs red as it was easier to see against the background color. Now we are going to add an initial to the token so we can identify which player this token belongs to. If you have art or a picture that you would like to use for this, you can do so, but remember that these are fairly small objects, and the more you shrink something down, the more pixelated and less recognizable it's going to become. So to add text, simply hit the T key on your keyboard or find the text tool in the Tools panel. Click anywhere and type the initial of the character. For this, we're simply going to use A, B, C, and D to identify our players. If you need to change your font size, hit Command T on a Mac or Control T on a PC to bring up the paragraph window, and from there you can change the font you would like to use as well as the font size and anything else about the font that you'd want to change. The font size can be changed either by typing in the value you would like or by clicking on the icon next to the font box and dragging left and right, left for smaller and right for larger. Now we want to make sure that the text is centered in the middle of the token we created. To do this, you will want to click on the Move tool in the Tools panel or hit V on the keyboard. Note that if you are still in the text field, hitting V will not bring up the tool as it will just add the letter V to what you already typed. So make sure you exit out of the text before doing so. After selecting the Move tool, make sure that you have the text layer selected, then hold Shift and click the layer 1 below it to select both layers. Then up at the top you should see the Align tool. Simply click the Align Horizontal Centers and Align Vertical Centers button to ensure that the text is centered within the circle. Now we are going to duplicate both of these layers for as many players as we have. To do this, make sure you have both the text and layer 1 still selected and either drag and drop them on top of the new layer icon or simply hold Command or Control and press J on the keyboard. Then simply go back to each copied text layer and double-click the text icon in the Layers panel to highlight the text and replace each letter with the desired initial. Now each of these player tokens is currently 2 separate layers, and to make them easier to move around, we are going to merge them together by selecting each text layer and the layer below it and holding Command or Control and pressing the E key. This will combine the 2 layers into a single object, which we can then simply move around using the Move tool, which was V on your keyboard. Or if you want to move your players as a group, you can select the folder called Player Characters in the Layer panel and then drag the players around. This will allow you to move them around as a group rather than moving each individual player at a time. Notice that now that you have merged these 2 layers together, you will not be able to change the text on each token. Alright, so now that we have our player characters on this map, it's time to create the creatures that they may encounter. So we could do what we did for the player characters and simply make tokens for each of the creatures and be done with it. But there are a lot of great assets out there that already exist and that you can make use of if you want to give a bit more of a visual flair to your game. One of the encounters in the cave is a group of wolves, so I went out and I found this image of a wolf and dropped it into Photoshop to use. But as you can tell, it's quite large for our map. So after renaming the layer, I shrunk the wolf down by holding Command or Control and hitting the T key for transform, and you see it brings up the bounding box around the wolf image. To shrink it, simply grab the corner of the image and drag it down to the size you want, which would be a single square. Depending on what Photoshop version you are using, you may need to hold down the Shift key while resizing the image in order to constrain the proportions. You can also rotate the image by hitting Command or Control T again to bring up the bounding boxes and moving your cursor slightly outside of the corners of the box until you see the curved double arrow icon. Just simply click and drag and you will be able to rotate at will. Now the wolf is looking good, but because of the coloring, it is a little difficult to discern the wolf from the background. To To fix this, we are simply going to do what we did with the player tokens and give the layer a stroke. To do this again, you do the same thing as you did before by double-clicking on the wolf layer and clicking the stroke effect. It should still have the same settings that you used on your player tokens, but if it doesn't or you don't like the size or color of the stroke, make the needed changes in the panel there. I chose to use a different color than my player tokens to help me at a glance see who is a friend and who is a potential foe. Now we need 3 wolves for this fight, so we are simply going to select the wolf layer and again hit Command or Control J 2 more times. Then select each wolf and move it to its desired location. Alright, so next I'm going to add the goblin token. I found this token online and it looks good, but you can see that it has some elements around it that I don't want. To get rid of those, I simply used the magic wand tool and selected the areas around the token. To select more than one area at a time, simply hold the Shift key and click on the new area you want to select. When you are ready to delete the selected areas, hit the backspace key. Then hit Command or Control D to deselect the object. Now just like we did with the wolf, we are going to hit Command or Control T to transform the object and shrink it down to the size we would like. You'll notice this token already had a red stroke around it, and since that's the color I'm using for my PCs, I'm going to change it by giving the goblin token a stroke effect like we've done so far. You'll see that when I added the stroke, it has both the green line I added and the red line which it originally had. To cover up the red line, simply change the stroke position from outside to inside and change the size of the stroke until it covers up the color you were trying to hide. Now that we have our goblin token, with the correct stroke color on it, we're simply going to duplicate our goblin token again and keep placing them around the map until we have populated the area with all the creatures that we want to include. So now that I have all my encounters placed throughout the cave, we are going to go over limiting your player's vision. So obviously when your players first arrive to a cave or a dungeon, they don't have a map of the entire area that shows all the enemies on it like we have here. That would ruin the sense of exploration and danger. So we are going to cover it up with what we call a fog of war. When I first was organizing my files, you may have noticed I made a blank layer called Fog of War. If you didn't already create this layer, just click the new layer icon and make sure this layer is at the very top. The way Photoshop reads layers is whatever is higher in the layer panel will cover up what is beneath it. We are going to use this to cover up the map and reveal things as the players explore. So on our Fog of War layer, that should be at the very top, we are going to make sure that we have the layer selected and simply hold Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC and hit the backspace key to fill the layer with the foreground color, which should be black. If it is showing up as any other color, simply hit the D key on your keyboard to reset the default colors in Photoshop, then try again. Now that the screen is entirely black, we are going to hit the E key on the keyboard to activate the eraser tool, or go to the Tools panel and find it there. Then we are going to essentially reverse paint and erase the areas that our players can see. Another thing to note is changing the brush size is super easy with the eraser tool. As you could simply either hit the bracket keys on your keyboard, right bracket will increase the brush size, left bracket will decrease the brush size, or you can actually go up into the brush menu that you'll see appear in the top left when you have the eraser tool selected, and you'll be able to actually use the slider there to increase and decrease the brush slider. You can also pick between a soft brush or a hard brush, just meaning that the edges of the brush are either going to have a hard edge or a soft edge to them, so it'll have kind of like a feathering effect when you use it. You can toggle on and off the visibility of the Fog of War or any layers by clicking the eyeball next to the layer. So when you're erasing the Fog of War, keep in mind what your players can and can't see. If they are outside, they can probably see quite a great distance, unless there's something blocking their vision like trees or walls or hills. If they're inside a cave, do they have dark vision? Do they have a light source? It's also a good idea to keep an uncovered image of your map nearby so you don't accidentally erase something that you don't want your players to see yet. The other thing to consider is, are the creatures you just added to the map hiding or standing out in the open? If they heard the players approach, they might have tried to hide to set up an ambush. Either way, you can toggle the visibility of each creature off until you are ready for the player to be able to see them. This is partially why we grouped our monsters, as you can toggle the visibility of an entire group or encounter on and off by clicking the eye next to the folder, just like you would for an individual creature. Alright, so now that we've kind of set up our map and our players are in position, we can begin to kind of show you how I kind of run things and how I can show the players what's happening without actually revealing the entire map to them. So in this example, let's say the players approached the front of the cave and they didn't see the goblins that were hiding out front. But the goblins also didn't notice them until they were right on top of them. So you had both sides roll initiative, and let's say as you revealed part of the map so that they're able to see at least a little bit of their combat area right here. Let's say after you collected everyone's initiatives, that player C ends up going first. So what I do to control combat is, you notice that as soon as I'm done painting, I switch back to the move tool. And when you have the move tool on, you can actually just right-click any object that is on your canvas and select that particular object. It'll pull up a list of everything that's layered underneath your mouse at the moment, but you'll be able to select the objects. This is why it's important to name your layers as you're going through, as you'll be able to figure out which one exactly I want to move. As you see, I zoom in a little bit on the map so the players don't necessarily get a sense of the size. You can quickly zoom in and out by holding down, I believe it's the control key and using the mouse wheel, or the command key if you're on a Mac. There's always the zoom tool that you can use just simply by hitting Z on the keyboard and then clicking, and it'll zoom into the areas, and then right-clicking will zoom you out. Alright, so we have player C going first, so you see I right-click player C, and now I can just drag him to where he wants to move. So say he wants to move in between the two goblins and attack the goblin that's below him. So he goes in, he makes his attack, whatever the outcome, doesn't really matter. Next, we'll say the goblins are up. So this one decides that he's going to make a break for it and try and run up and out of the cave. But due to the 3 attacks of opportunity that he takes from players A, C, and D, they end up killing him before he actually makes it into the cave. And so to simply remove a character, you saw that I right-clicked to make sure that I still had the goblin character selected. And then you can simply either hit the backspace key to delete the layer, or if you're planning on using this map again later and you want to be able to reset it, or if you want to still keep the tokens on the map to make sure you know where the bodies are or whatever, you can simply toggle off the visibility in order to hide dead creatures. And those are like the basics that you need to be able to run combat. You can move creatures around like that. You can add more or drop out creatures if you need to. You can turn on and off their visibilities. Just remember simply just right-clicking on the token that you want to move and selecting the correct one. As long as you've named it right, shouldn't be an issue. And then you can move it around the map as much as you like. And keep in mind as you also move your characters around that they might reveal more of the area. So say one of the characters ran into the cave after the goblin, they might be able to see a little bit further in there. So you may have to switch to the Fog of War layer and begin erasing more of the map just to show what more of them see. So maybe they saw the wolves that are at the entrance there. Now the last thing that I kind of want to go over real quickly is sharing your screen with your players. So depending on what software you're using to video conference with your friends for the game, may be different. Currently we're using Zoom for our group. We ended up getting a subscription because if you use the free version, you only have about 40 minutes of playtime before your call will shut off, and so you have to keep redoing your calls, and depending on how long your sessions last, you could end up redoing the call maybe 4 to 5 times or even more a night if you have an extra long session. So you'll notice that we created all of our monsters and everything over in the layers panel, and if you don't want your players to see that, it's simple enough as what you can do is you'll see I pop the window out of the Photoshop itself. So the Photoshop is still there in the background, but it turns the window of the map that I'm working on into its own separate screen. And then for example, since I use Zoom, when I use share screen, I choose to particularly share just that window. That way they can't see the layers palette, and so they can't see that there are going to be monsters or how many encounters there might be into this area. It kind of keeps things hidden and a surprise still for your players, and that way you could still control it without actually like losing your ability to toggle things on and off or move things around, but you are still keeping that information back from your players, keeping the DM screen up, so to speak. And that should be everything you need to know to be able to run games through Photoshop. The more proficient you become with it, the more like fancier things that you can do with them that I may cover if I decide to make another video like this. But you can do things like put an aura around your player to show that they're either concentrating on a spell or the area of effect of a spell. You can always choose to have a blank layer underneath the fog of aura, so you can make notes on there for your players if you would like to do that. It gives you plenty of options using Photoshop, so the more you use the tool, the more that you're able to kind of communicate that with your players and kind of bring that feel of the player's mat, the miniatures back into the game, even though you probably can't use them since you're all at a distance right now. So I hope that this video was helpful in clarifying how you can use Photoshop to be able to control your D&D games, and especially your combat sessions and everything like that. So hope you have a great time using it. I know it worked actually really well. My players enjoyed actually being able to see detailed maps rather than the hand-drawn stuff that I usually do. So it's a lot of fun. I think your players will end up enjoying it.